You're listening to Always Player One, a solo board gaming podcast.
Hello and welcome to Always Player One. I'm Scruffy.
I'm Norm, and today we're going to be talking about Anachrony, as well as looking at AI opponents for solo board games. But before we do that, I'd like to quickly mention Planning Phase again. So our first episode of Planning Phase went live last Friday, and I think it went down pretty well. What did you think, Scruffy?
Yeah, it was exactly what we were kind of hoping it would be. Obviously, it's a bit rough around the edges. We're still finding our feet with it and open to suggestions, but I really enjoyed recording it and it's been lovely getting feedback from our patrons. And I do want to just say a massive thank you to people who are supporting us on Patreon. Oh, and I was informed by my partner that it's patrons, not Patreons, as we've been calling people who support you on Patreon. So thank you to all our patrons for supporting us. You guys are awesome. But if you're just listening and you aren't able to or can't support us on Patreon for whatever reason, then that's absolutely fine. There's no pressure to do that. Obviously, it gives you access to the planning phase. But if you're just here for these episodes, then brilliant. Thank you for being here. It's awesome to have you. No pressure ever to financially throw money at us or whatever. But just wanted to say a massive thank you again to our patrons.
Yeah, absolutely. So very quickly, if you didn't listen to last episode, the Planning Phase is a separate show which we put out every 2 weeks between our main podcast. It is a short 20-minute show where we sort of give you a behind-the-scenes glimpse as to how we choose what games we're covering next. We're looking to include polls in those as well, and we release it to Patreon users only. So if you do want to listen to Planning Phase, feel free to check us out on Patreon. The link's out in the description. Now, moving on, here's something you can take part in for free. Scruffy and I have organised our Mage Night tournament. We've been talking about this for a while, and it's finally happening. If you'd like to join the tournament, it has already begun. We're in round number 1. All you have to do is join us on Discord. Again, the links to that are in the description. And play a solo conquest game of Mage Night of city levels 5 and 8. You have to do that before October the 16th. If you want to join, just jump on the Discord, and the full rules are there in the tournaments channel. But that's a lot of fun. I've already done round 1, and yeah, looking forward to seeing who's going to join me in round 2.
Yeah, and we'll see you there. Good luck to everyone who does join in and take part, and it'll be interesting to see who comes out victorious.
Indeed. Now, without anything else left to plug, let's jump into the episode.
Okay, so today we're talking about Anachrony, like Norm says, and I'll just give you a quick description of what the game is for anyone who doesn't know. So Anachrony is a 1 to 4 player game all about time travel and surviving the apocalypse. In this game, you take control of a remnant of humanity following a specific path. The choice of path determines your starting resources, as well as certain special powers and the evacuation bonus you receive. The aim of the game is to send your workers in powered mechs to spaces on a central board called the Capital. Here you can recruit more workers, mine for resources, build buildings and super projects, and gain or manipulate other resources used in the game. The game is played over at most 7 rounds, with each round being split into several phases. I won't go over them all now, but importantly, at the start of the round, you are able to take some free resources or bonuses, which you must pay back to yourself in future rounds by time traveling and spending the resources. Essentially, you take a loan in the earlier turns, which you pay yourself back later. Failing to do so causes anomalies, which lead to negative victory points and block some spaces for your buildings. After the 4th round, an event called the Impact occurs. From this point on, you can evacuate, essentially sending a mech to the World Council space and earning points based on your path's evacuation objective. Also, the capital spaces each have 1 more use, but the last use of them involves additional bonuses. Once used, the space is blocked for the rest of the game. When all spaces are blocked, or after the 7th round, the game ends. In solo play, you play against the Chronobot. This dummy player takes turns by rolling a d6 and then referencing on its board which action it will take. The chronobot will often, but not always, take actions which block spaces on the capital board, and will always act for at least 3 turns, but immediately passes when the player does. The chronobot will accrue points throughout the game by gathering sets of workers, buildings, research tokens, and just plain victory point tokens. At the end of the game, you compare your score with the chronobots and see if you win. I think that's it in a nutshell. Have I missed anything, Norm?
I don't think so.
So before we get started, I just want to throw out there that we will be using the word AI, automa, kind of interchangeably. We'll also be referring to the AI as a dummy player. When we've talked before in previous episodes, we've had comments about that these aren't true AIs, they aren't capable of learning, and I think that's totally valid. We'll probably unpack that a bit more later in the episode. But I do just want to say that we're using this term very loosely. It's kind of generally a commonly used term, I think, for automas in board games and for dummy players to call them AIs. So I just wanted to throw that out there before we start today, that we'll be using the word AI very, very loosely. So, moving on.
Let's dive straight into Anachrony, because it is a really interesting game, right? In my opinion, it's one of the most unique worker placement games I've played. Certainly from the iconography alone, right?
Yeah, I mean, let's get that little bugbear out of the way right now, shall we? Like, it is like trying to learn a whole new language when you pick it up and try, and even if you've played before, like I have, and I've played a few times, every time I pick it up and I just go, okay, but what does the triangle mean? Okay, but what does the hourglass mean on this? But okay, so this is a crossed out circle with an arrow pointing to a square. Wow, it's a bit of a nightmare, a bit of a hellscape of arcane symbols and icons.
And if it's a game that you kind of have to play regularly, otherwise you will forget. Or at least I will. You probably listening with superior intellect won't have this problem, but for myself, of less than regular intellect, it's a challenge. I'd played against a chronobot a number of times, and it was Scruffy's first few times in preparation for this episode. Before playing for the first time, I thought I'd jump on Tabletop Sim and we'd talk through some things together just to make it easier. And I remember Scruffy, he said to me, "What does this mean? It has a circle and then an exclamation mark and then two water drops. What does that mean?" I was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I came into it thinking, okay, I know how the game works. I know what everything means. I just need the chronobot explained to me because, I've played this a bunch. I was totally lost. I spent, as long playing the game on my first playthrough as in the rule book, just having to quickly reference this and that. It didn't help that I was looking at an outdated version of the rule book as well. But yeah, it was a nightmare.
Yeah, and I just want to make this very clear. I don't think this is a big criticism on the game because once you know what all the icons mean, it is fairly intuitive and it is not a complex game. I actually think it is pretty standard, pretty midweight, and pretty easygoing to learn. It's just the iconography is very unique, and it took me. I'd say it takes most players if you haven't played the game in a while, you kind of have to relearn that language. It's not it's not exactly take 2 wood for 1 stone sort of icons, is it?
No, it feels like, because, for example, whenever you take a path and you pick a leader, all the leaders' powers, they're not similar. They happen in different phases and relate to different things, and it just feels like the icons are a smorgasbord of different things pulling you in different ways. So it's hard to get a kind of a grip on it.
Yeah,
maybe it is just about the phases, that because things trigger in different phases, you have a lot of different moving parts, different things happening, and you're trying to represent all those different things with symbols. It becomes very difficult. Yeah, I'm not sure what the solution is there.
I don't know, but I'm quite happy with the gameplay because let me tell you now, Anachrony, I think, is a wonderful game.
Yeah, it's great.
It is a brilliant game. So I've played a bunch solo. This is, like you said, your first time in preparation for the podcast. How did you get on? What was your experience, Scruffy?
So it reminded me how much I enjoy playing Anachrony, for sure. It's a really fun game and some really nice, interesting decisions there. I love the engine building. I love the time travel in it. More games need to do time travel. It's such a good little mechanic. It's neat and it's fun and it's exciting because the way I quickly mentioned in the thing is, you at the start of the round, near the start, you are able to just take a little reward. I'll take a gold. I'll take a worker. Whatever. You can take up to 2. Ooh, very exciting. I'll take 2 different resources. But then you kind of need to pay it back later, and to do that, you have to have built a time machine and then use that time machine and spend the resources. So it's a really lovely kind of, I don't want to say push your luck element. It's a really lovely investment.
I would say push your luck. I would.
Yeah?
Yeah, because there's so the way it works with the anomalies and paradoxes is, so the game is played in over rounds, which are called eras. And as you go through the different eras, as Scruffy said, you will request either 0, 1, or 2 resources at the start of each era. But the way that comes back to bite you is, before you take any actions, first you'll look back at any previous eras that haven't had all the resources paid back, and whoever owns the most tokens on there, whoever has borrowed the most in that amount in that time frame, has to roll a dice. So you might not even be punished for it, but you could be. So it is a push your luck, I would say. I don't know if that fits your description, Scruffy, but I think it's that level of sort of randomness and the fact that you could get away with it maybe suggests that, it is a kind of push your luck game. You could borrow as much as you want and hope for the best, or you could play very safe. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, and the idea that you might not have those, or you might need those resources even more in the future of turns. If you kind of forget about it, you might not be able to pay yourself back, which is the anomalies are then worth negative victory points at the end of the game. It's an interesting sort of thing, and the way it works with the automa is they just randomly. They roll a dice to determine how many tokens they place on that era. So you don't know whether you're able to sneakily get away with one in case they put 2 tokens on there, or 1, because your score is directly compared to the automa. So if they're generating anomalies at the same rate as you, fine, you're evening out. But if they put 0 on there, you're presumably generating more anomalies, which is not good.
No, not good at all. But one of the really interesting design choices for solo play, one thing that I really like about it, is the AI player, the Chronobot, starts as first player, and you resolve the warp tokens in player order. So when you're second player, you have the option to have them roll the dice, see how many they're going to put down, and then respond to it, which is interesting because actually going first in the solo mode is very important, because as soon as you pass, the Chronobot passes, which means you get to take more turns when you're first player than the Chronobot does. So there's a really interesting push and pull whether you want to stay second to react to how the Chronobot warps, or whether you want to go ahead and take first place and take more turns than the Chronobot does. I think it's an interesting decision, and that specifically doesn't exist with a multiplayer game, because in multiplayer, you all decide what you want to warp and request from the future at the same time. So that's interesting, and I really enjoyed that push and pull.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I think overall it is almost definitely better to take first player. It's a very powerful space to make sure you reserve as in solo play, because they get an extra turn, and a turn for the Chronobot, it's always fairly impactful. Like they'll gain at least the least I think they can ever get is like 2 water, which is saving up for points in the future. But usually they'll get at least 1 victory point, maybe a whole bunch more. I haven't done the maths on it, but it feels like they get quite a lot. So denying them 1 turn, it does feel like that is a big swing.
Absolutely. But denying yourself negative 2 points because you have a chance to react to what they warp is also quite powerful. But I do agree, first player is important in this game.
That was one thing I didn't really like about the AI. Is it did feel that there was a few, for me at least, kind of glaring criticisms, and I want to address them, because I don't know how other people feel about this. I know that you mentioned that a lot of people have one specific thing they talk about with the AI, and I don't know what that is still. But for me, I noticed obviously that first player space being really important kind of meant it felt like I had to take that space, and I only noticed that kind of partway through when I got used to the mechanics and was a bit like, oh yeah, that's really obvious and annoying. But also it felt like, usually when you play Anachrony, one of the things I like about it most is you kind of aim to luxuriate on your turn. You try and do as many things as you can. You recruit as many people as you can. You build as many buildings as you can to get spaces to put all your people in and power up as many mechs as you can. You try and do as much as you can, right? Because doing stuff is fun in a board game. When you're playing against the AI, it's a different game. It shifts it to that you have to be incredibly productive on your turns. And in some cases, it's better to just not act. Even if you can act, it's better to not, because the AI will get more points than you will get for acting that turn. And that kind of really I did not like at all, because obviously in a multiplayer game, the next player isn't going to pass immediately just because you're acting lots. Whereas in a solo game, as soon as you pass, the AI passes. So you're determining how many turns they have. So it felt to me a bit like you're rewarded for inaction, which I think is fundamentally not fun. Did you notice that or feel that at all?
No. It's the short answer. No.
Okay.
I see your point, but no. I have never played Anachrony solo and thought the best thing for me to do right now is nothing. I can see how you have to be a little bit more efficient, I suppose, and try and do things in as quick a turn as possible. But I've never stopped my plans because the AI would get another go. And I think the thing is with Anachrony, both solo and multiplayer, is I think following through with your own actions and your own plans is more important. If you need to do that extra thing, I've never sat and played Anachrony solo and thought, I'm one turn away from getting the resource I need for my evacuation plan. I've never sat there and thought, it's worth me not doing that so the AI doesn't go again. I've never felt like there's a reward for that inaction. Although I see your point, you want to get your plans done in as efficient time as possible. I don't think it's something I've ever done. I've never stopped taking my turns prematurely because I was worried about what the AI was going to do. Also, I think it translates quite well from the multiplayer game, because when you play multiplayer, you have to think about how many turns you're going to do before you start doing your turns and your actions, because of the way you power up your mechs. You know, you have the option to power up as many mechs as you want that you can fit on your player board, as long as you can afford them. But there is the possibility that you can power up more than you need. So I feel like the fact that you're trying to be as efficient with your turns as possible so the AI doesn't go, it kind of feels the same as playing multiplayer.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, that you need to prepare your mechs beforehand to have an idea of where you want to go on the capital board. The issue I have is that it feels like, I mean, the way I love to play the game is I power up as many mechs as I can, I take as many actions as I can, I build as many buildings as I can, because there are buildings that have action spaces that require an action to use, for example, and then they give you usually resources or allow you to transfer resources. And I feel like the game almost punishes you for playing it. Like that, I would imagine I could do less by sending out just free mechs and not spending any resources to power up additional mechs, and just not do as many super projects by the end of the game, not get as many points for the evacuation as I would if I'd powered up all my mechs. But the fact that I'm not spending the resources to power the extra ones, and then that awards the dummy player extra turns, it feels kind of almost counterintuitive. Like, so I'm spending resources to be able to do more. That more is getting me more, but it's also giving them more. That I've never played a game before where I felt like by investing in my own development, I'm also investing in the other player's development. You know, usually when I play Anachrony, I feel excited to be taking as many turns as I can. I look for opportunities to do more and more and more and whatever, because it doesn't directly affect the other player getting to do more as well. In fact, it does the opposite. It gives them less spaces to go to. Whereas the Chronobot will always act on its turn. Even if it's blocked out of spaces, it will just generate 2 water and a victory point. So it will always get a victory point every turn. So every turn you take costs you essentially a victory point. And that feels really wrong to me.
Does it? Like, did you ever stop? Did you ever not complete your plans because you were worried about what the AI would do?
Yes.
Well, you're weird.
Well, okay, I carried on for the essential stuff that I was trying to do, but towards the end of the game, so at the start of the game, I played it like I normally would, and I took as many turns as I could, and I was enjoying taking my turns, but then I had that realization partway through the game, and I got really annoyed that this AI was like, every time I took the AI's turn, I found it annoying and a little bit upsetting to be dishing out points to it. It made me feel unproductive by comparison, by when I was being productive. So the more I did, the more unproductive I felt, because if I took little turns or turns to just generate a few resources or go to make a bit of water just to have a bit of water, whatever, because I've got a spare mech lying around, or you could say it's poor planning that I was approaching the game wrong, and that's fine. But I think any game that invites you to approach it with efficiency rather than enjoyment in mind, it doesn't feel like it's quite as fun as it could be. I feel like the real joy for those games, for me, a lot of Euro games, is to try and do as much as you can and make moves, and then with those sort of seeds you've scattered, reap the harvest of what you've sowed. And Anachrony is more like, it says, okay, decide exactly how many flowers you want to plant and exactly where, and then don't do any more, because if you do more, if you do excess, you're giving away points.
I understand that. Yeah, I actually kind of agree with you.
I always convince you in the end, Norm.
I personally think it's an interesting push and pull, though. I think that's part of the tension. I think that is part of what makes it an interesting opponent rather than not. But I very much get what you're saying. It seems counterintuitive.
Yeah.
I get it.
Just to sing its praises for a bit, because I'm gonna just wear my heart on my sleeve now and say that overall, I'm not a fan of Anachrony's AI. But with that said, I do really like its simplicity. So I think what it does really well is it functions in a way that allows you to, it kind of almost apologizes for being there. It comes in, it says, all you have to do is just roll a dice for me and then put a token on the board, or give me a few resources, and then I'll get out of your hair. And I'll block you occasionally, but not always. And there's that kind of uncertainty there. And it's kind of, it's like playing against a hollow man. It's like playing against a scarecrow. That's how it kind of feels. Or it feels completely lifeless. But at least it's simple and doesn't get in the way too much, except for when it blocks you. But that's not getting in the way, that's adding kind of the main conflict of the game. Blocking spaces is what Euro games are all about. And if you had another player against you, they need to block your spaces now and again. Sure. So it functions in a really streamlined way.
Isn't it just, though?
It's very unobtrusive, isn't it? It seems to say, I know I'm an annoyance. I'll make sure to only get in the way some of the time for fun. And maybe that's all you want from an AI. Just a straw man to occasionally block your spaces in a way that you didn't quite expect it to happen then, or that was unlucky that it happened at that moment. Isn't that exciting? And that for most of the time, it's just going to stay out of the way and let you play the game. And that's fine. It functions really well at creating that kind of slight uncertainty, but slight predictability, and allows you to kind of have something to play off something else to consider when you're prioritizing what to do on your turns. Do I go to this space or this space first? Well, let's have a quick look at what the Chronobot might do on its turn. That's quite easy at a glance. I can see what that might do. And then on its turn, I roll the dice and immediately know.
One thing I really like about the Anachrony's AI is exactly what you said. You don't spend any time playing for it. You're always playing against it. Whenever you consider what it might do, you're considering it on your turn. You're not considering it on their turn. On their turn, it's obvious what it does. It literally tells you. I've played against some AIs where you kind of you go through a number of different options. If it's here, it could do this. If it's not, you can do this. If the wind is blowing west, then stand on your chair and do a 360, and then it will do this. You have to go down like a little flowchart. With Anachrony, it's very easy. You roll a dice. It tells you what it does, which means the only time you consider what it might do, or the only time that's uncertain, is on your turn, which is great because that's like playing against the real player. When you quickly look over at its player board, you go, okay, well, it definitely can't build this turn. So although I need to build a building, I won't do it now. It can recruit this turn. So if I want to do any recruitment and I want to do it on the cheapest available space on the board without paying excess resources, I'm going to recruit now. So you can still execute all your plans, but you have to account for what the chronobot's going to do.
Yeah.
And that's great. That's like playing against a real player. When you're actually performing its actions, it's just you roll a dice and you do what it says. You do not spend any time considering, or it takes 20 seconds, maybe less. So one thing I really, really like about the AI in Anachrony is it is just an AI. It is you against that. I don't ever feel like I'm playing for it or making its decisions. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And, it's a cut above, for example, the worst sort of automa or AI where you just flip over a card and resolve a random effect that you had no way of predicting, or something like that, where there's no presence, there's no consideration. It's just something random happens. You get it a lot in a lot of solo games where events happen and you can't have known what event was going to happen. It's just an event card. Ooh, your monkeys come and wreck your shelter, whatever. I'm thinking specifically of Robinson Crusoe, which is a fine game, but I really don't like that specific aspect of it. And there's no way to know what the events are going to be, how they're going to affect you, plan and prepare for them, and prioritize your turn based on that AI, that dummy player. Because it's not a dummy player in Robinson Crusoe. Whereas in this, it is a dummy player. You've got this, like I say, presence next to you that has its own stuff going on, which you can kind of account for.
Yeah, and it's nice. It's very simple to go, I want to do X, Y, and Z in this era. Firstly, let's have a look at the dummy player. I know it's not going to do Y or Z, so I'll do X because it might do X and that will get in my way. And to people listening, you might think, well, that's a bit too deterministic, but it's not, because it has these kind of swingy moves as well. Would you say, Scruffy?
I would say that there are times in the game where it doesn't give you an interesting choice because of the nature of it. I'll give you a specific example. So towards the end of the game, I was very near the end of the game, I could either evacuate with my last mech that I had available, or I could build a super project. Now, evacuating was the safe option because it's the most points and I'd been building towards it all game. If I built the super project, that would have netted me way more points if I get another round, because I can evacuate in that next round, and I've got an extra super project now, which I won't be able to build if I evacuate this turn. The problem is that the round could end if the automa rolled a 2, because there's one space left on the board. If they roll a 2, they're going to take that space. The game will end that round. So the thing I mentioned at the start about the uncertainty of the game ending could be on that round, could be on the next round. That was how it played out for me. And so I had this really horrible choice between go risky, build the super project for an extra 6 points, or play it safe, evacuate, and don't worry about the super project. Obviously, the sensible thing to do would be to play it risky, because there's only a 1 in 6 chance I'm going to get burnt for it. But what it meant was that either way, I was unhappy, because what did happen is I did play it risky. That was the only sensible thing to do. It's only a 1 in 6 chance. Got to play it risky and hope for the 6 points. But if I'd rolled that 2, I realized how bad I would have felt. Like the thing I'd been working for all game, the evacuation, was completely undermined. And that just came down to a roll of a dice. But then I didn't roll a 2, and I still felt bad. Like I felt a bit sweaty and a bit sleazy. Like I was successful, but not really responsible for my own success. I just took the most sensible option. I took the 1 in 6 chance of getting the gamble right. And I think at that point, I kind of just got really sick of it and got really annoyed.
No. Let me stop you there. You really have to explain to me how that is a uninteresting decision, because you said at the start of that there are times when it doesn't give you interesting decisions. And then you outlined a really, really interesting scenario where, because of what the AI had potentially lined up, you didn't know when the end of the game was going to be. You didn't know whether to push your luck or to play it safe. That is a really interesting situation. Are you joking?
That's really funny.
That's super interesting. I was like, wow, what's going to happen? And you said obviously the obvious thing to do is to take your chance. I don't know if I would have done. I know how bad I am at rolling dice.
I don't find that interesting. I mean, it's really cool that you do. And, for anyone listening who thinks that sounds like an interesting choice, this is the game for you. Like, because that's as interesting as I guess the AI gets. But to me, because the chance was so clear cut, it's a 1 in 6 chance. there's no denying that it rolls a 2 or it doesn't, and that's something that's not related to what I'm doing or the game I'm playing. It's just it might end the game if you're unlucky. I just felt really cringe. I didn't like it, and because
That's
I'd
mad.
invested.
That's mad. It might end the game if you're unlucky. That's so exciting.
Yeah, but it's not exciting because the choice is obvious. Like you take the gamble on the 1 in 6 chance. I like with push your luck games there to be some obscurity. I don't like knowing the specific odds. I find games like that really, really dull. Like if it's the specific odds, I just play the odds because I don't believe in magical thinking.
What would you have done if you had exactly the same choice, but there were 2 tokens stacked on the build action? So the way the AI works just specifically is you don't just roll a dice and resolve the action. You roll a dice, resolve the action, and then you move whatever number the dice rolled onto the next action. So you could end up in a position where 2 stack on top of each other and that action becomes then the most likely. Would you have acted differently then? Would you have still built the super project if there were 2 tokens stacked on that space, for example, Scruffy?
So if it was a 1 in 3 chance,
Correct.
I'd still, I guess, play the numbers game. I don't know. It's not an exciting choice for me.
It's
Like
that's interesting.
You know the exact probability, right? So you could sit and maths it, but it's just boring. It's like, and it doesn't make me happy whether I succeed or fail. It's just based on the roll of a dice that is disconnected from me.
No.
Okay, I know we always bring up Mage Knight, and I'm going to bring it up again as well later in a moment, but in Mage Knight, I lose track of the dummy player's deck. I don't know what color card is going to come up, and you don't have much control. So the pacing of that, I can't work out the probability, so I don't try, and I don't obsess about it, I don't think about it. I just take my turns as feels right and feels natural. I don't try and work out how many turns I've got left. If the dummy player said we roll a dice every turn and if you roll a 2 the round ends, that would be sickening. Like I don't know when that's going to end. Then I just take my turns and hope the turn doesn't end.
No. It's so interesting that we both like I love Mage Knight, but it's interesting that we have a different opinion on that one specifically, and on Anachrony as well, because I know you enjoyed the multiplayer game a lot. I think the AI in Anachrony is lovely for a number of reasons, and we've ragged on it a bit, so I'm going to shine some light on what I really, really like about it. One is the simplicity. As we already mentioned, is quite clear that you are playing against it and not having to take its turns for it. That is one of the most important things for any AI for me. 2, I like that when those tokens stack up, or when you know the odds, which is what Scruffy doesn't like. I like that you know the odds of what it's going to do, and you have to manage that and take your turns around it. I really like that. And 3, I think it gets kind of a similar score every time. And some people might say that's a bad thing. I like the kind of predictable nature, because it means that I feel kind of clever when I exploit it or when I act around it. And it does all of that just by rolling a dice and moving a token and taking 10 to 20 seconds out of your time. I think for what it does, it's very, very clever. And I think the push and pull between taking more turns, gives it more turns as well, is interesting and puts you in a difficult situation. It puts the screws on you and says, you got to really think about what you're doing this turn, because every action counts. I think those are all good points. Obviously, you have exactly the same opinion, but just, all of those things I said are true. It's just you have the opposite
reaction.
Conclusion. The opposite reaction. That all of those things are true. That is how the AI operates, and that is what makes the game interesting. But for you, it's not for you. I guess that makes sense. But...
No, yeah, I think it's totally valid that we came away from because I think that dilemma that I described and outlined there, it runs throughout the game on a less impactful level. That you look at things and sometimes you'll have, the AI's got a 1 in 6 chance of building, or it's got a 1 in 6 chance of recruiting a person. I need to do both. I don't know which I'm going to do first. And it makes you prioritize which you want most, because
Love that.
and that's fair. I personally don't like how it's then resolved, because you just roll the dice and hope it doesn't get your number. And inevitably, I mean, it happened at a different point in the game. I was like, I have to time travel now and decide where I want to go. And depending on what I roll, it was a good or bad decision. I have no other information to go on other than that there's a 1 in 6 chance it's good, a 1 in 6 chance it's bad. I moved there, rolled, it was bad. That was a wasted move. I gave them victory points and wasted my move. What a horrible situation. And because I rolled the wrong number on the dice, it was a 2 then as well.
It's just a cursed number. But yeah, no, I think it's good for all the reasons you think it's bad, which is, I guess there's no way to bridge that gap. Normally we'd try and have an interesting discussion about it, but literally all the things that I agree with every point you said, except for I think they're all good.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally valid, and it's interesting, and I guess I'd be really interested to hear what you guys think and where public opinion is with me or with Norm on that one. Cool. I just want to talk about, okay, I feel like I'm just the absolute antagonist this episode, but I'm going to be honest. We're always honest in what we think about things, and I do want to just bring this point up before we open up to more general stuff on AIs. I felt like the AI, the Chronobot, had no personality.
Really?
Yep. And I think one of the main reasons for this is that it's as simple as the mechs it sends to places don't have workers in.
Oh, that's exactly what I was going to say, though. This is ridiculous now. I was going to say the fact that I think it plays into that. It's kind of lifeless. These are the machines that have taken over the world, right?
Okay.
That is what you're fighting against. The mechs that go out, they're just mechs. They don't have workers in them. They are this artificial intelligence that you are playing against as a player, but then also in the game, it is this artificial intelligence that is taking over the world that you have to try and rise and overcome and do better than. That's how I look at it. So I get what you mean when you say it has no personality, but I think that's all done on purpose. I think that's the point of the Chronobot. And the fact that it's even called a Chronobot rather than it's having its own, it doesn't have its own path. It's just called a bot. It is a group of robots that are, they don't have a personality, but that is I think that's played into the narrative, and I think that's the point.
That's really interesting, and I love that because I didn't do that at all. I didn't take that. So usually, I'm the one who's coming up with all these silly emergent narratives things, as we talked about last episode. But okay, I get that. What it does for me though is I don't care about beating a robot.
Oh no, yeah, that's fair.
And if you do, fantastic, and I get it. There's a real rise against the machine sort of mentality and wanting to do better than technology. I know you hate technology, Norm, so yeah, I totally get it.
I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't had any audio trouble this episode. I haven't been pulling my hair out with my computer all day. What are you talking about?
Okay, so that's really interesting that we've taken that in a completely different way, and that I personally didn't feel any investment in winning or losing. I felt like because I was dishing out the points to the AI, and it was just taking kind of almost what felt to me like completely random moves, even though you can see what they're going to be, they are still just random rolls of a dice and automatic and nonsense. It felt like I didn't care when I did the final score. I couldn't care less what it scored, because its score was based intrinsically on how many turns I took. So I felt like I was kind of gifting it a score, and it was just making senseless random moves. That's how it felt to me. Whereas when I play against something like, and I said I'd mention it again, the dummy player in Mage Knight, I do care about winning. I care about beating the cities and getting a good score, because I want to beat Norowas, the dummy player. That's how it feels. Even though I'm not directly competing with the score of Norowas, I want to not let Norowas get the better of me. I don't want to lose the the campaign. I want to win. I want to beat the conquest or whatever, because it feels like I'm getting one over on that character that to me has personality, because each of the mage knights in my mind has a distinct personality. And maybe that's just me, but it's something that I think a good dummy player does, is it offers life to the game. And that's something that I'm really glad to hear the Chronobot does for you, but it absolutely and totally completely didn't for me.
I feel like it's just a theming issue, isn't it? Maybe.
I think it is tied with mechanics, though. I mean, the dummy player in Mage Knight feels like they have personality because they have a deck, they have crystals, they have specific colors and things tied to them, and they develop as you play, they set a pace. Whereas the Chronobot just takes a random move on a roll of a dice. It just does something after you, which...
One of the things that saves the Chronobot for me is that you do just roll the dice and resolve the action. But resolving the action, it has like a thought process, you know? When you take resources, it tells you which order it wants to take them. When you recruit people, it tells you which order you want to take them. When it builds a building, it tells you to go for the one with the highest point value. You can know the consequences of all of the Chronobot's decisions that it could potentially make within a split second, because you know exactly its thought process. It doesn't just roll a dice and build. It rolls the dice and you know it's going to build specifically this or this. And when it's going to mine, it doesn't just randomly mine. It mines and it takes what it needs, which is what I think makes it clever. And the fact that it's all easy to manage and so well laid out.
Yeah, it acts with all the lifeless certainty of a machine, and if you get a kick out of beating that, brilliant. But to me, it was lifeless.
Brilliant.
So just following on from that conversation there about the life or lifelessness of the AI, I just want to kind of unpack why that's so important to me. And I just wondered if you agree with this. I'm going to talk quickly about intrinsic versus extrinsic reward. I'm not sure if you've mentioned this much before on the podcast, but just to lay this out clearly what it is. Intrinsic reward is when you do something that is fun and you enjoy doing it for the sake of doing it, essentially. Extrinsic reward is where you enjoy doing something because you get external rewards, praise or payment, for example. And I think that in solo gaming in general, there is a distinct lack of an extrinsic reward, which is different to when you're playing multiplayer. So board games always have intrinsic reward. They're fun to play. It's fun to interact with the pieces and do the fun stuff, make the crunchy decisions. That's all intrinsic reward. It's stuff you're enjoying regardless of what other people say and how much they call you a nerd. It's fine. But when you play multiplayer, you also usually, when you play, are playing for the extrinsic reward of beating another player, right? And getting that sense of achievement there, that sense of value. And it's the best sort of extrinsic reward because you're not sure if you're going to get it, which is, there have been studies. I'm not going to bore you with all the studies and stuff. In my idea, what a dummy player would do is it would make up for that. And what I think the ambition of a dummy player should have is to give you that sense of an extrinsic reward. And I don't know how possible that is and whether it's just me, wishing for something that it can't possibly bring into a game. But I think the more life you add to an AI, the more you get a sense of that extrinsic reward, even if it's artificial. Would you agree with that? Or am I just talking nonsense?
Of course I agree with that. I think that makes perfect sense. And, sorry to hear that you didn't experience that with Anachrony's Chronobot. But yeah, absolutely. Everything you said there, I also agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah. It's something that occurred to me while I was playing, and I think it's very important. I think it's something I'd love to unpack more in future episodes, and as we encounter more AI systems in games, I wonder whether I will ever encounter one that really kind of nails that for me. It's something I'm going to be on the lookout for, is whether it can give me that feeling that I've conquered something outside of myself, that it's not just that I've beat the game and its mechanics and my own puzzle solving thought process, the intrinsic stuff, but that it's given me a sense that I've beaten something extrinsic from the game, if that makes sense. And I think that's what a dummy player should be. It should be this kind of go-between, this joker, the jester outside of the game that interacts with it in a similar way to how you're interacting, or maybe even a completely different way to how you're interacting with it, but it interacts with the game and is separate from the game.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, except for I think the Chronobot does that. But obviously,
yeah, fair enough.
and I think you labelled a perfect example of it in your example earlier about how it could have ended the game. I think that's, for me, it sums up exactly what you're saying. That is the Chronobot interacting with the game and being that jester, being that threat, that external threat that you're not guaranteed to know exactly what it does. And yeah, I don't know if I would have been as brave as you in that example. And I think that's maybe just a difference of us rather than an actual problem with the Chronobot.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Let's move on from the AI. We can swing back around to AIs in general in a moment. Anachrony in general. There is a lot to like about Anachrony, right?
Sure, definitely.
Definitely. I think some of the implementations of theme and mechanics and the way they integrate are excellent in Anachrony. Some of my favorite examples, we've already spoken about the time travel element. When Anachrony was explained to me, and the time travel specifically was explained to me, I said, well, that's just a loan. You're just taking a loan. But when I played it and I realized that you had to build a time machine, and then in order to pay it back, you have to use the time machine, which has to work well enough to go to the area, the error that you borrowed it from, and then give it back. I think that's really, really clever. And that's all done just from placing a worker. It's very clever, I think.
Yeah, so the longer you leave the loan, obviously the more chance you are of creating an anomaly, because you roll on it every time if you're the highest amount of warp tiles in the era. But also it's harder to go back that far in time if you've not got a big enough time machine.
Unless you invest in a better time machine. Yeah, that's fantastic. And probably one of my most favorite things about Anachrony is the impact, because I've not played any other worker placement game that has that kind of level of the game state has completely and permanently changed now, and you know when it's going to happen. I think that's really interesting. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, that makes sense, definitely. Although it did. This goes back to our first sort of mention of it causes a deluge of rules to be put on you halfway, just as you're getting the hang of the game, and you're like, okay, I get it now, I'm in the flow. You flip over a thing and there's a whole load of new rules to look at. Other than that, it's great.
Yeah, I really, really like it. And the researching as well. I'm just naming things I like about Anachrony. I feel like I have to compensate because I really like the game, and we spend a lot of time talking about negatives. But yeah, the researching, I love the way that when you research, you choose one dice that you get to determine the result, and the other one you have to roll. I love that. I think it's very clever, and I'd like to see that in more games.
And that they're not even. The dice, so one of them determines the shape, which is either circle, triangle, or square. So there's a 1 in 3 on that dice, and the other one determines the sort of pattern on it. And there's like 5 different patterns and one wild side of that dice. So yeah, it could be anything. It's crazy.
And sometimes it's really important to you what pattern is on it, and sometimes it's really important to you what shape it is. And these are called breakthroughs, and you do that through researching. And it goes to show how the theme is perfectly integrated in mechanics. The research does, it feels like a research. It's very clever. It's very, very clever. How do you feel about the workers? Because not all workers are the same in this game. What do you think about that?
The workers are really interesting. I love the things that they can all do something a bit different and unique. You've got your scientists to research, and your administrators to recruit more people, your engineers to do the building and mining. That's fantastic. And the fact that they also have specific buildings that they're better at, or that they are specifically required for. Wonderful. And then you have the geniuses who are wildcards, but can't be used in certain situations where you need a specific worker. Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah, it's all a really lovely design. I think the game is really fun, and I feel like the main problem for me is that the Chronobot feels like it's not my cup of tea. But other than that, the game is absolutely wonderful. I'm totally with you there. I love the time travel. I love the buildings. I love the research. I know that's your favorite thing in the game. Like every time I play with you, that's the action you take most during the game. I like that you have the World Council spaces, which are just kind of, you can go there and you can take first player, and there's another one that just, they both allow you to take an action that's blocked. Wonderful. That's what you need in a game like that. Yeah, it's a beautifully designed game for sure.
So just going back to the workers very quickly, not only do they do different things, and not only are they so the way it kind of works is every worker can do sort of 2 core actions. They can go to 2 different types of places and not a third space. But they all have one that they're best at doing. If you go there with this worker, you get a bonus, which really helps for learning the game as well. It really helps for teaching you how to be good at the game, because there are rewards as you go through, which I really, really like. But also that they're not always ready to be used. They're either ready or they're asleep or resting when they return from work. I really like that you have to manage that. You have to manage your workforce. I don't feel like, apart from the games where you have to feed your workers, I'm thinking like Agricola, Caverna, that sort of Uwe Rosenberg style game. Apart from that sort of trope, I haven't seen anything like that, managing your workforce the way you do in Anachrony, where they're not always ready to be used. I thought that was very interesting, and yeah, I really, really like the way the workers act and how they're all unique and they all behave differently is very, very cool. So too is the buildings. You briefly mentioned that you can build buildings. They go onto your player board and act as additional spaces, which is great, because as the game goes on and your workforce goes bigger and bigger and bigger, you start to realize that on the main action board, there actually isn't that many places to go, is there, Scruffy?
No.
You can recruit, mine, build, or research. And those are the 4 actions. You can also grab water and you can trade resources. Apart from that, that's it. Those are all the spaces. So as the game goes on and you have twice as many workers you started with, you very soon realize, I need to start building up on my own player board, and I need to make my own unique action spaces, because the main board that I was going on is now too congested. I can't use all my workers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you also are limited to 6 mechs, which you need to send your workers to the main board. And usually 3 of them require you to pay resources to power them up. So the more you can do on your player board without using the mechs, the better, obviously. And obviously the buildings give you access to certain... Sometimes they just give you stuff that is available on the board, like they might give you resources. So instead of going mining, you can just use your building, or water. Instead of going to purify the water on the main board, you can just use your building. But sometimes, like we said, the time machines are buildings, and they require and they aren't possible effects that aren't possible to do on the main board.
So moving on from Anachrony and just talking about AIs in general, we have kind of briefly spent 10 minutes or so looking at AIs in episode 6, and we got a lot of comments just off the back of that, as you said earlier on in the episode. Do you think there's any one little nifty definition of what an AI player is that we could perhaps look to unpack, or what is your thoughts on what constitutes as an AI player and what is just a part of the game?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to call almost anything an AI in board games because it's such a loose term. I kind of just use it interchangeably as the word opponent in the game, like a dummy player. Even to some extent, I apply it, and I shouldn't, but I do. And I made the mistake earlier today where I apply it to decks of cards, event cards that come up. I call them AIs. I know they're not, but they act in the same sort of fashion as the kind of antagonist to you in the game. So I suppose the best sort of definition for an AI in a game that I would describe as would be, I think a true AI needs to have some unpredictability and it has to interact with the game state. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's there's room for a lot of interpretation. I'm sure
Yeah.
people are already writing comments saying, well, what about this? This has a presence and unpredictability. Is that an AI? But I
Yeah.
get exactly what you mean because I know what kind of games you play, etc. One
Yeah.
thing that surprised me is that when we were preparing for this episode, I went onto Solo Board Gamers Facebook group and I said, I would like to know some of your favorite AIs that are not automa decks, because automa decks, for two reasons. One is automa decks are fairly common and almost like the standard for a lot of solo opponents now, and two, because that is the topic of episode 13, right? We're talking about
Yeah.
automa decks, and we have a special guest on who designed the automa deck for the fan-made automa deck for Great Western Trail, as well as doing a couple of other official automa decks as well. So that's really exciting. We're looking forward to that. But moving on, I asked this question on Solo Board Gamers Facebook group, and some of the answers really surprised me. Some things that I wouldn't consider to be AIs. I give you my best example was somebody said, my favorite AI opponent is the Nemesis in Aeon's End. And I was like, what? That's not an AI opponent.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and so immediately my first thought was to dismiss it. I was like, that's not an AI opponent. That's just a part of the game. And then more people were commenting that. More people were like, oh, I really like this AI opponent. And again, it was like a co-op game where they play against a big beastie type thing. And the more comments I got, the more I was like, well, it's clear that there's not really a crystal clear, neat definition for what is an AI opponent and what isn't. I think for the purpose of this episode, when we were doing research for it and before we started, we were thinking of a part of our definition was something that takes on the role of another player, rather than like the Nemesis in Aeon's End doesn't assume the role of a player, right? That's built into the game. Whether you play that solo, whether you play it multiplayer, no one's ever going to be the Nemesis. But if I played Anachrony solo or Anachrony against you, you have essentially taken the place of the Chronobot, right? And that's the difference. When I play solo, the Chronobot has taken your place. It is taking a player's position at the table, if that makes sense. And I think that's what when someone says an AI to me, that's what I think of. Something that is taking a player's seat at the table so that you can play the game against it. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, there's no game without the Nemesis, is there? It's a core fundamental part of the game. You aren't playing the game unless the Nemesis is there. It's the main antagonist, and I guess that's the thing, isn't there? There's antagonist AIs and there's opponent AIs, or other player AIs if you're playing co-op. So I guess you'd boil it down to those two, wouldn't you? Antagonist AIs and player AIs, and there's kind of the overlap there when you get things like the Chronobot being your antagonist and your other player.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't say, I was kind of thinking, well, where does that end then? If you use that logic, like the Nemesis as an AI, then where does that end? Do you say the infection deck in Pandemic is an artificial opponent that you're playing against? Like, I guess you could make the argument, but nobody would. Nobody would say, my favorite opponent is the infection deck in Pandemic. Although that is what you're playing against, it's quite clearly not a player. So when I use the term AI, I think I mean, personally, it is trying to emulate a player.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful because, the confusion I had earlier that I highlighted of saying that the event deck in Robinson Crusoe is an AI. It's the same. It's not. It's an antagonist, right? And I think that's a really good distinction to say that an AI takes the place of another player, and that can mean they're an opponent or an adversary. But antagonists aren't necessarily AIs. They're kind of core mechanics in the game, even if they have a distinct personality. And I think that's where the confusion comes in, is the personality of it. So the Nemesis in Aeon's End has a very clear personality. So it's tempting to...
personality, depending on which one you're playing against, right?
Exactly. And so it's very easy to see that as an intelligence because it's got a personality. Whereas I think in mechanical terms, it's actually not an... Maybe we should say, instead of AI, we should say an AP, an artificial player. I guess that's what we're more interested in.
Yeah, I think you're right, Scruffy. That's a great term. Not AI, but AP, artificial player. You heard it here first. This is an always player one exclusive. We're going to coin the phrase artificial player.
Same initials as the podcast as well. So.
Yeah, artificial player number 1. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't played against a lot of artificial players in my games. I've played against the Stifle Automa, I've played against the Chronobot, and probably a few more, but none spring to mind at the moment. But yeah, that's kind of what my thoughts on what an AI or an AP is something that takes the space of a player.
Yeah, the interesting one is when you get into things like the video game versions of board games, and you get because obviously video games are often about AIs trying to be antagonists or players, and you do get your APs in there. And I remember playing Through the Ages and just getting absolutely trashed by the APs in that. The hard mode artificial player in that is absolutely killer. And then when I switched over to playing the digital version of Scythe, it was just too easy. So that was really fun and interesting to see. But other than those sort of digital versions, I'm just racking my head now trying to think of what artificial players I've come up against. And the only things I can think of are the dummy player in Mage Knight, obviously an artificial player setting the pace for you.
There is Volker as well.
Well, Volker wouldn't be an artificial player. They are the antagonists in that, aren't they? So they're like the nemesis in Aeon's End.
Perhaps. But I always...
There's no game without Volker. He's a moving city. Just because he's got the personality doesn't mean he's a player.
Interesting. I hate it when you use my logic against me.
It's true, though, isn't it? I mean, that's a really interesting distinction, because before recording this episode, I would have said Volker is an artificial intelligence. I would have used him as an example, but he's not. I mean, there's a clear distinction there. You can say he's an artificial intelligence, but he's not an artificial player. And I think that's a really important distinction to draw when we're talking about this thing, that some things are meant to stand in for players, some things are meant to... There's no game without them. They are the antagonists of the game. But then you could say that without the artificial players, there's no game. Like in Anachrony, if you didn't have the Chronobot, that antagonist that you have to try and beat its score, you would just be moving... I suppose you could play the game, I guess.
You could just do a beat your own score. The game exists.
Yeah, it's true.
The game is Anachrony, and the Chronobot is an additional challenge. It's an additional player. You could even play 2-player and have the Chronobot as a third player. There's no...
Yeah.
There's literally no reason I can think of why that wouldn't work. It is just there to take up the space of a player. Now, when we were looking at doing this episode, we were kind of talking... And if you listen to Planning Phase, you'll know the way we talk about doing episodes, we're kind of like, yeah, we'll cover this topic. And I think this time round, the more I've prepared for this episode, the more I've realized I've bitten off more than I can chew, right? Yeah. I was like, let's just do an episode on artificial players or AIs or automas. And the more research I've done, the more I think we need multiple episodes to unpack each different type of AI differently, because there are so many. I'll give you an example. So Peter wrote in, aka Lovelace, on our Discord, and he said, if you're going to look at AIs, here's some things you should consider. Look at Anachrony for its dice or roll to resolve automa. And then maybe look at viticulture as like your first step AI, because it's simple. Maybe look at Gaia Project or Tapestry for an up-to-date involved automa. Maybe look at Great Western Trail for a fan-made one. Maybe look at Isle of Cats for an interesting non-automa that tells you what to score for the AI. Maybe look at Paper Tales for its great solo card drafting implementation. Maybe Nova Luna / Spring Meadow, where you more or less play a different game. Maybe Newsford or Aphisa Odin, where you block yourself. Maybe Underwater Cities by its block by pattern solution, or Terraforming Mars. And honestly, the list goes on. And
wow.
each one is a different type. It represents a different category. And it made me think, we are not going to cover this in this episode. So maybe let's talk about Anachrony. Let's outline some definitions that we think are useful, which I think we've done. And then let's maybe look to the future to unpack each of these separately, right? I think that's the only way we're going to be able to, because there's no way we could cover anything like that in one episode. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, that is there are a lot, aren't there? It feels like, there's as many different automas as there are different games. It'd be interesting to sort of divide them into the two categories of artificial player and, I guess, antagonist AIs, and to see whether there is any kind of middle ground there or grey area. But I think on the whole, that's kind of what they all fall into those two categories.
And like we said, next episode, episode 13, we are inviting a special guest on who has designed a number of automa decks, and that episode is specifically going to be about breaking down automa decks, breaking down their design and taking a deep dive, which we would have liked to go into this episode, but being a little bit too general, we thought let's move it on to episode 13 where we can take a real deep dive into one specific category and unpack that before moving on and leaving AIs for a little bit. But yeah, I'm very much looking forward to that. Are you, Scruffy?
Oh, definitely. It's going to be an absolute blast. I think the most interesting question to ask, really, though, isn't what is an AI or what sort of AI is it? It's what makes a good AI. And I think the main thing that's come out from this experience for me, and from hearing what you were saying earlier about what people categorize as an AI, whether it is or isn't, is that the thing that we latch onto, and it's a totally human thing to do, is personality and personability, and I guess the relationship you form with the AI, whether it's an artificial player or an artificial antagonist, it doesn't matter. I think the best AIs, in my opinion, are ones that are functional, yes, like the Anachrony one, but the only way you can really enjoy them is if you're able to, like you did with the Chronobot, and like I absolutely failed to do with the Chronobot, if you're able to make a connection on some level.
Yeah.
And I think that is essential for an AI. We need to look at the personality that it evokes and the relationships that it invites.
Yeah, absolutely. It's personality. For me, there's a number of other things as well. There's ease of use. One thing that is important to me is that I feel like I am not taking the AI's turn. The AI is taking its own turn, and I'm playing against it and not for it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
When the AI asks you to do too many things, look at this, if it is X, resolve Y, you end up feeling like you're trying to figure out its turn for it. And I don't enjoy that. Ease of use is really important for that reason, because that adds to the gameplay, it adds to the immersion that I'm playing against someone. If the ease of use is taken away, then that feeling of playing against something is also taken away, because I'm no longer playing against it. I'm kind of playing against it, but I'm also trying to work out what it needs to do, which isn't fun, most importantly.
Yeah, you devote your energy, you divide it between you and the AI rather than devoting it to your turns, which is, that's a total failing then, isn't it? Because you are playing as two characters, aren't you? And that's that's not good.
Yeah, you're kind of playing both sides of the table, which isn't fun. And I think the challenge for people who design AIs and artificial players, the challenge is striking that balance. You want your AI to not just make decisions, but make decisions that make sense given the context of the game state. Those are the really successful AIs, when the AI can look at what's happened and seem like it's reacting to it organically. But the issue is giving the AI that much information and having it still remain easy to use for the player is difficult. I feel like the more energy you put into making the AI responsive and reactive AI, the more you ask of the player sometimes. And striking the balance, I think, is probably the single biggest challenge for somebody who designs those types of games.
Yeah, it's something that's a lot easier to do with computers, obviously, and algorithms and stuff. Obviously, you get things like chess and all sorts of games that have been around for years with artificial opponents. And I think it does lend itself to video games rather than board games.
Yeah, excellent. And I'm looking forward to the next episode to actually ask, to be able to ask, how did you come up, overcome these problems? There's answers that I don't have at the moment, but looking forward to finding out. I think another thing that makes a good AI for me, as well as having personality and ease of use, is also the challenge. You need it to be challenging, right? I know I said I enjoyed the Chronobot, but one thing I will say is I haven't lost against the Chronobot. I kind of know what score it's going to get, and because I know its probabilities of everything, it's fun to mess around with that, but it means that there's not really many ways to make it harder. So variable difficulty and the challenge and replayability is also important. So if you can nail personality, ease of use versus responsiveness, and variable difficulty, I think you got a gold standard of AI.
Yeah, the one other thing I would throw on there is uncertainty and certainty. So predictability, but not too much predictability. So it acts randomly, but not too randomly. It's an interesting kind of fine line there, isn't it? That you don't want just a deck of cards to just give you a random thing, not based on the game state, like you were talking about earlier. But at the same time, you don't want to know exactly what it's going to do on its turn, because then it just becomes too easy. And I think that's an interesting fine line to tread and tightrope to walk across for AIs.
Yeah, gosh, there's so much to unpack. So the more I looked into this, the more I thought, wow, there's a lot for us to go through here. We can't get through all of it today, but I think that's a really good start on our ongoing relationship with artificial players. So we haven't done this in a while, but final thoughts on Anachrony. Obviously, as a multiplayer game, you enjoy it, right?
Yeah, love it as a multiplayer game. As a solo game, I did enjoy my playthrough, and I do intend to play it again. But I just don't connect. I don't click with the. There's no chemistry for me in the Chronobot, and so maybe it's not my cup of tea. But I can totally see, and from what you've explained today, I can totally understand how it might just be my own relationship with that poor robot.
Oh, and I've kept you in suspense. Before we end this segment and start looking at the responses we got from last episode, I very quickly want to let you know what it is the designer of Anachrony said he would do differently next time.
Oh, yes, this is the thing that I mentioned way ago in the episode where I said that there are people have a general criticism. Was it the designer, was it? Because this was in our Discord. Somebody sent a link to a critique of Anachrony.
So it was on a BGG thread. Somebody was criticizing Anachrony, and the designer of the game actually agreed and said, yeah, that is a problem. And it was the turns. It was your criticism, Scruffy. It was that there was no variability on how many turns the Chronobot would get. You would always know exactly how many turns, because it's based on how many turns you take. And the normal game doesn't do that, so it doesn't feel like it's emulating a player. Rather, it's its own separate system. And that's exactly what they said on the thread. So you were right. That's the reason why I was going to bring it up earlier, but I completely forgot because I felt like we already covered it, because it was exactly your criticism.
Yeah, this occurred to me. It actually came out of when I walked away from my first game playthrough of it. I realized, wait a minute, I could have won this game by doing nothing all game. And this isn't true. When I looked at the rulebook, I see there's a little failsafe for that in there, which is the exact failsafe I kind of came up with that would fix it. But the failsafe is that the AI or the Chronobot always takes 3 turns. If it didn't always take 3 turns, then theoretically what you could do is take the first player on your first turn of the game and then do nothing for the whole game. It will still be generating a few anomalies during the game, which are worth negative victory points. So you could win with 0 victory points and it being on minus victory points. Luckily, like I say, that's not true because it takes always 3 turns, which is, like I say, what I thought would be a good fix for that. But at that point, I realized you really are punished for acting in this game. And you just need to fine tune getting down like 4 really good actions on your turn, and you'll win. That's my theory.
Real. So that's kind of our scrambled mix of thoughts on Anachrony, its own AI, artificial players in general, and in future episodes, starting with next episode, we're really looking forward to getting to the specifics of artificial players. But moving on from that, let's look at responses we got from the last episode, shall we?
Fantastic, yeah.
Before we do have a look at responses, Scruffy, what is the question for this episode?
So the question this episode, in preparation for our next episode when we have our special guest on, what is your favourite automa deck and why? And if you respond to that, we will be able to read those out in the next episode and get our guest's opinion on it.
So we had a few people responding from the last episode. Let's unpack that now. The first one was from Peter again, who's I've already read out some of his feedback, but Peter wrote in. Okay, so this is in response to the question about emergent narratives in games. It says, for me, this is a hard question because I never remember details of a game, but more the feeling I had when I was playing it. I love it when a game, either solo or multiplayer, is very close. In multiplayer games, a tie is my favourite game result. I think games that do not have a fixed number of rounds help for that. Can you escape with the treasure in Clank? Do your heroes in Gloomhaven have enough cards until the goal is reached? Can you stop the attackers before they burn down Rome in Pandemic Fall of Rome? Aside from close games, I enjoy the narrative more if there are more individual characters. Legacy games are great for that because they may name characters, places, and people you meet. A great pool of cards helps a lot as well. I'm happy if I get Canada Goose in Wingspan, and I'm happiest if I can organise a horse riding event for the daughter of my house and the fabulous Mr. Fairchild in Obsession. Have a great week and say hi to Scruffy. Hi, Scruffy.
Hey, yeah, what an awesome response. What was that last one? Fabulous Mr.
Obsession. It's called the game.
Obsession. Oh gosh, well, I've never heard of that, but that sounded fantastic. That sounded like one hell of a story. And couldn't agree more about the goose for sure.
Yeah, and I think you said something very interesting about how games that don't have a fixed number of rounds help tell a story because they're more player driven, right?
Yeah. I think that makes total sense. Where with a fixed number of rounds, you feel like the story is more prescribed, whereas when you have sort of free reign and the game kind of has other mechanics that drive the end of the game, and you're not really sure when it's going to end, it feels a lot more organic, doesn't it? And I totally agree with that. When I first got into board games, I was really put off by games that have fixed number of rounds. I thought that was a really lazy design. I've since kind of come to understand them, and especially for games where you want a nice strategic battle with someone, you want to know when it's going to end so you can plan your strategy out to perfection. But those sort of games, in my opinion, they don't invite as much emergent narrative as games that allow a lot more free reign over when it's going to end, which is
tighter. It's a tighter design, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
you know, a board game is just a box full of algorithms, right? And players can choose the ones they want, but the tighter those algorithms are, you know, fixed number of rounds, fixed number of turns, the more similar experience you're going to have. If you want to really control how a player is going to feel about the game, you tighten those screws up a little bit more, right? If you know you only have 10 turns in a game, and you're told that at the beginning of the game, that game is probably always going to be a similar length no matter who plays it. Whereas a game like, obviously I've spoken about it before, I'm a massive 18xx fan, those games are entirely player driven. Depending on how you play the game, depends on how quickly the bank is depleted, which depends on when the game ends. You know, when I first got into that hobby specifically, I played an 8-hour game of 1846. Now last time we played that, Scruffy, we played it in just under 2 hours.
Yeah.
It shows you the different ways you play, the different stories you can tell. And I think, it all depends on how tight or how loose those screws are. And fixed number of rounds, absolutely, they limit the amount of story you can tell. But it's not a bad thing. Those games exist for a reason. And I like a whole number of them.
Yeah, I suppose it's not necessarily that they limit what you can tell, but they make it feel like it was not something that came out of your game by your choice or your story. It's something that was already there. It's a structure that already existed, and so that isn't necessarily emergent narrative, more kind of a established narrative, if it is a narrative at all.
So we also had Kendall write in. So just listen to the Aeon's End episode. The evolution mechanic does seem pretty rad. I actually think the choice of deciding when to deal the powers and whatnot was one of the best things about the game in general. Sounds like they made it even better for the legacy game. And now this is interesting because actually Kendall doesn't like Aeon's End. So he says, although the majority of other stuff you said you liked is what I hated. For example, the random turn order. You also really nearly touched on one of my favourite bits about the game, which is leaving spells and breaches in order to manipulate where they land in your deck cycle. So casting a nice big spell when you have a hand that can support it is great because they then stick together in your deck for the next turn. I also remembered another thing I didn't like so much about the game, which was how small the market of cards are to choose from. In most deck builders, you get about 10 actions, which aren't currency, but in Aeon's End, you only get 9, and that includes currency cards as well. So it feels a bit samey in the way that the market works as well. So I thought that was interesting. Maybe we could unpack that here, because we obviously both really enjoyed Aeon's End. Do you recognize any of those points that Kendall made there?
Yeah, I mean, on that last point, especially, I noticed that a lot more in the base game. The market stagnates and doesn't evolve between playthroughs, whereas having a smaller, more sort of focused market works really well, I think, in the legacy game, because having the limited number of options, it is a conflict. And if you had too many choices, it would make things a lot easier. But that wouldn't necessarily be a good thing. And it would especially make things easier between rounds where you have to sub out 2 of the cards because, well, I've got 3 cards that do basically the same thing. In Legacy, the way it plays with the fewer cards, you have, each card has a specific function, and you try and kind of refine it down so they're all distinct and unique, or at least you do it for me. And I think that was a really fun journey in the legacy game that when I played it. And like I say, it did not exist in the base game. So I think that is a totally valid criticism of the base game for sure, where it would be nice to see the market evolve during that game, or even just have a bigger market. That makes a lot of sense.
Specifically, the reason Aeon's End can get away with it is because there are more things to spend your currency on that isn't just cards. So the fact that you have charges, the fact that you have breaches, the fact that you can use it on your tableau as well as your deck means that the market of cards doesn't need to be as big, because you don't spend as much time deck building as you would in potentially other games. So I think that's why it works for me. But yeah, I thought those were really interesting points, and I'm glad that Kendall enjoyed the episode as well. But that's all the feedback we got from last episode. Thank you guys so much for writing in, as always. Don't forget to write in on this episode. The question again was,
what's your favourite automa deck and why?
And like we said, we will read out your suggestions on the next episode. Now, you can write in to alwaysplayer1podcast@gmail.com. You can also contact us on Facebook or on Instagram. Links to both are in the description, and it's at alwaysplayer1podcast on Instagram. But also on Reddit, we are always_player_1. We hang out a lot in the solo board gaming subreddit, so look out for us there. And yeah, those are kind of all the places you can get in contact with us. Don't forget to also join the Discord in time for the Mage Night tournament. The cut-off for round 1 is October the 16th, and it's free to join our Discord.
We're also playing Among Us at the moment, like everyone else in the world. So if you're interested in playing that, we sometimes shout out on the Discord there. I'm going to make a specific channel for that. The next game we're playing is today, when this episode comes out. So if you hear this episode and fancy joining us this evening, we will be playing 6 p.m. BST, and just pop into the Discord, say hello, and if there's room, I'll invite you in to the Discord where we play.
And one final plug, don't forget you can listen to our behind the scenes episode planning phase. That will be out next week, and you can listen to that if you are a member of our Patreon. So if you want to sign up for that, the links are in the description. Any tier that you select to support us will give you access to the planning phase, and you won't want to miss the next episode because we've got something a little bit special planned. So don't forget to join us on that as well. But that's kind of everything for this episode. So I hope you enjoyed our kind of, I would say, mixed thoughts on Anachrony.
Very polite way of putting it. I'm really glad you guys could join us. Thank you guys so much for listening. Whether you support us on Patreon or not, it's awesome having you here. And feel free to say hi. Come and see us in Discord, say hi, talk about whatever. It's a great community. You guys are awesome. Have a fantastic day.
That's in 2 weeks, guys. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to support the show, don't forget to check out our Patreon page. The links to that are in the description. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Always Player One. Until then, reach out on Facebook, Instagram, or by email to keep the conversation going.